Hi, everybody. I'm a psychometrician. I'm the chief psychometrician for Certiverse. I'm also trained as an IO psychologist, so I have a background in helping organizations uh, do things, and most of my work has been in technical statistical areas. For instance, as an IO psychologist, I taught structural equations modeling and meta-analysis. So I am the chief psychometrician for Certiverse. I have worked as a psychometrician as well as a IO psychologist. I was a past member of the faculty at IIT. I still teach psychometrics every once in a while when they need it. And I've got extensive background with selection testing and validation as well as certification exams. Less background in educational psychology, which is a common background for psychometricians. So.
All right, great. So just sort of an outline about things that we will be getting to. So if there are things that these encourage you to think about, or you have additional questions as we go through, feel free to let us know. But with that, we will get started with our first thought. And we've had a little bit of discussion and talked about this, and it was something that seemed like a broader topic that sort of got under the headlines a little bit. So do you want to talk a little bit about
Sure.
what the research is
So
saying right now?
I think people are starting to talk about using three option multiple choice as a viable alternative. I think by far the most common is four option multiple choice. Some people use five options, some people use true false. But three option hasn't been very common. And I think that the word is getting out that that's a good format. And that's good because there is actually quite a bit of research, several studies, I think, that suggest that three is optimal. But I'm a little worried that people hear that headline and they don't hear the rest of it. And by optimal, when these studies find that three options is optimal, they're based on the assumption that you have a set amount of time and that it takes a shorter amount of time to read a three option multiple choice. So you can fit more items onto an exam. And in that context, having more three option multiple choice items is probably better than having a smaller number of four option multiple choice, which isn't a particularly controversial statement because the the longer it tests, the more reliable it is in general. The three option multiple choice individually are slightly worse, but being able to add more is makes it better. And if you carry that over into true false, for example, the true false, it's easy enough to guess. It's a 50-50 chance of guessing. So I'm thinking of, for example, Fred Lord has a paper. So does David Badescu. These are decades old papers about the optimality of three option multiple choice. And again, they're predicated on the idea that you have more three option items. The individual three option items are worse in the sense that it's easier to guess. And guessing means you have less information about the candidate. But if you add more of them, it's better. If you push it too far and go to two option, true false, that pushes it too far, and two multiple choice items aren't as good as one four option multiple choice. And I think, by the way, that the reason that four options are so popular is because it's close to optimal, and it's not as hard as creating a five option multiple choice. But anyhow, so it's exciting to see the field, picking up on that research, but it's a little disheartening if people are taking a 50 item exam that has four options, so 200 options total, 50 items times four options, and they're converting it into a 50 item, three option multiple choice. They should be converting it into more like a 66 option multiple choice, or 67 options. That would keep the number of options and the amount of exam content the same. So that's great. There's also some research on innovative item types, and I think that most of the time when programs use innovative item types, it's for reasons that are, let's call them business reasons, wanting to seem innovative, for example, and those are great reasons, and I don't have anything to say about that. Like if that's why you did it, that's great. But the psychometric analysis of those items is that they are individually more reliable and valid, or at least reliable. Maybe not valid, but maybe valid. But reliability is important. Each individual item tends not to be very reliable, so having a more reliable item type, that's really a win. But they take more time as a rule, and I suppose there's probably innovative item types that you could imagine or create that might not follow this, and that would be the way to go. But with the ones that were studied, I'm thinking of a paper by Mike Jodwin. The net result was that you took up more exam time with these innovative items, and they didn't make up for the loss in the number of items that you could put on. So the innovative item types were a net loss. But I would say that taking my psychometrician hat off for a moment and putting my exam developer hat on, or thinking about this as a manager or executive, I would probably recommend that you use the item types that fit your content the best. So if, an innovative item type like matching happens to meet some sort of, or drag and drop, creating a network diagram or something like that, fits your content best, then, that might be a good reason to use it. The other thing I would say about item types is, again, from a practical standpoint, is I'm not sure that it's advantageous for anybody to have a variety of item types. I would probably pick a couple item types or a small number of item types. Have most of the items be either 3-option or 4-option. If you're transitioning, I guess it's not the end of the world to have to have both and coexist. But I think that the more you standardize on a small number of item types, the more professional and clearer your exam will be, and that'll be better. So that's what I have to say about item types.
Great. We did have requests come in as well, if we can, either cite the research or just provide the links afterwards. And of course, we will do that, probably a combination of both as we go. So
I applaud you for holding me accountable to cite my sources.
yeah.
So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart as an IO psychologist. I took a class in job analysis. And so, I think, and one of the reasons that I think streamlining a JTA is important is that a JTA is telling you what the important parts of a job or a role are. And the people telling you that are the subject matter experts. The subject matter experts more or less know. Maybe you're documenting it, but you're primarily documenting it for people outside of that group, or to, have a document that everybody shares. The subject matter experts are not learning about the job from this process. So it can seem like you're doing your taxes or filling out an audit form or something like that. And there are programs that, really put on the fatted calf and have in-person meetings and, use it as a bonding experience. And that's great if that's the purpose. But I think there's plenty of situations where streamlining JTA could be a significant advantage. So I think about, like, well, what adds to the value of JTA? And this is a shameless plug for Certiverse, but I don't think Certiverse is the only tool like this. I think a decentralized process really does make the process go better. If you don't have to schedule meetings or travel, and it can be decentralized. And I think you need a tool, like if only there were a platform that did that. I'm sure there's other tools. I'm not sure that Zoom, for example, is a good tool, because Zoom is great for collaborating, but it's not great for keeping track of where you are, allowing people to interact with the tasks, and so on and so forth. So I think that a decentralized process that is supported by a good tool, it would be a significant advantage. And I don't think that you need a large number of tasks. The job task analysis, the idea of tasks, is you're analyzing a job, and you're thinking about all the tasks that the person does, and you're going to infer from those tasks the knowledge and skills required to perform the job. And I think a traditional approach to JTA is to think of lots and lots and lots of tasks. But I think what's more important is that you have a sense, either through your interaction with subject matter experts or other experts, about what the knowledge and skills are, and that you pick tasks that represent those knowledge and skills. And once you have a set of tasks, maybe it's 50 of them, that represents those knowledge and skills, you don't necessarily need to consider every other task, because there's probably innumerable tasks, especially if you are very detailed in your in the tasks that you use. So I usually tell people 50 to 150, but each task, at least in our methodology, which is very common, becomes a survey item and makes the survey longer. And surveys over 100 items, are often onerous. So I think that there's an advantage to reducing the task list. And I think the key is representing all the knowledge and skill. One problem with the traditional approach of doing JTA is that you don't find that out until after you've done the survey. So an innovation that Certiverse has created that anyone can copy is just to ask the SMEs, when they're creating the task list, to indicate the domain that they think this is associated with, or domains. and and that way you know ahead of time before you do the survey which domains are represented and how many tasks there are. And that turns out to be, I think, quite useful. So you should steal that if you're not using Certiverse as your platform. And it is important. It turns out I won't go into the details, but it turns out there's very good mathematical reasons why most common JTA processes, the number of tasks associated with a domain is very influential on the final exam blueprint weights, but the survey results are less influential. And as an empiricist, that breaks my heart to tell you this. And it's very controversial or heretical, but it's not my brand new insight. Somebody pointed this out to me, and I didn't really put two and two together. But the consequence of that is that the survey sample size doesn't really matter that much. In fact, if you have 5 SMEs helping you create the JTA, and those are the only 5 SMEs you can get to conveniently do the survey, you're not going to get, even though 5 is a small number, you're not going to get very, very different results than if you could get 5,000. And that is not a fact that most people realize. And it, again, is not anything I'm super excited about as an empiricist. That breaks my heart. But I could explain the math behind it. It's the survey results are just not that influential. What is influential is the number of tasks that you associate with each of the domains. That drives almost all of the variation in the exam blueprint weights. So it is quite important to get that right.
Nothing sadder than a broken-hearted empiricist.
Yes, exactly. And let's see. And one other thing about one other little detail, I know of no research that suggests that more ratings for each task. It's very common to then create the JTA survey and have each task rated on frequency and importance. I know of no research that shows that more ratings are better. I think one rating probably captures the lion's share of the value of having people rate the task. So I would, if you're trying to streamline things, I would probably focus on just having them rate the importance and not rate the frequency or the risk of failure or anything else. But pick one, whichever one's most important. And importance is a nice generic one. That also works better for situations where you're trying to apply JTA to a knowledge base instead of a job role, which is very common, I find. If you're trying to build an exam that measures the knowledge of a product or a set of standards or anything, then the frequency probably isn't as applicable. So again, I know of no research suggesting that you're losing a lot if you just drop frequency or whatever your second scale is and focus on importance. And the last thing about samples, although I just said samples don't matter, I would think about how it looks to whoever's going to be looking over your shoulder. So if you're going for ISO 17024, do not use 5 people. That will not look well to the auditors. But if you're not gonna, and the vast majority of you won't be doing that or have any other auditors, it's not going to make a practical difference, and you should use a sample size that, is convenient. Or make it 30, but you don't need to have hundreds or anything like that. So those are my thoughts about making JTA streamlined.
Fantastic. We did have a supporting comment as well, just with 100% agreement on the shorter surveys because
Go Kara.
Yeah,
people can be very rude about long surveys. We get these emails that you're disrespecting me by having this long survey. I'm sorry, it's the methodology, but if you can do it with shorter, then that's much better. So then the next question is about Strawberry. I don't know if you all know this, that OpenAI came out with a new model. It's called Strawberry. It's also called O1, I guess, O1 Preview and O1 Mini. It's in beta. And I didn't know a lot about it. It's based on GPT-4. So there's reasoning involved, and it's using an engine. In fact, I'd be very surprised if it wasn't their Omni and Omni Mini engines, which are already available to us. And you might say, well, what is good about what's important about the Strawberry model? 2 things. They paid a lot of people to improve the reasoning of the model. So people like PhDs or graduate students, and that is where they get this idea that the model is operating at the level of a PhD. And this additional research, which you could think of as like fine tuning, improves fairly, I was about to use the word dramatically. Let's say noticeably improves the poor performance that GPT-4 has at math tasks and to some extent at coding tasks like generating syntax and also solving problems. The other thing that the model does, and this part is they're less transparent about, but the model apparently does some reflection. It doesn't simply take your prompt and produce an output. It thinks about it a little bit in the sense of, is this right? And they're very, they have not been transparent about what that process is. But the consequence is that using the strawberry models, there's two of them, a mini and a regular size. They think they flash a thinking for a while, so they're slower in producing the responses. And apparently they're doing some process like producing an output and then asking a different part of the model is the output, a good match to the answer, and if it could be better, how could it be improved? And that approach is called agentic, or it's an agent. And if you haven't heard that term, I think that that may be the next big thing in AI models is thinking about agentic approaches. So I've not tried this on every exam task, but I've tried this out with item writing. And item writing may not be the best use case for having an agent. The better use case might be something like, how do I, schedule this party with all these with all these people's schedules, or how do I, travel to some place or plan a vacation for me, or any of the things you'd have an assistant do for you that requires multi-step thinking. That's really what this is aiming for, and this is their first model of this nature. And so in item writing, what we did was we had an existing project, and we had some items that didn't work out very well, about 5 of them out of 50, so 10%. And so we sampled about 13 items, the 5 troublesome items, and about 7. Did I do that math right? And some additional items, 8 additional items. And so that we had 13 model items. It's a small sample, but we had already analyzed them under some approaches to prompting GPT-4, and we compared that to the strawberry models, both of them. And in some ways, the models were the models are better. Overall, I would say the models are better, but they're not perfect. But there are some metrics by which they are much better, and there are some metrics by which they're just about the same. But they improve upon the task. But I guess I think of this as a good news, bad news situation. If you were hoping the models got better, good news, the models got better. If you're hoping the models are perfect and operated as if they were human and we don't need SMEs anymore, I have bad news for you. They are not there. They're better, but with all of these models that we've looked at heretofore, I mean, I'm still amazed how good the responses are, but you're going to have a human SME look over every item and verify that the item is correct, that there aren't 2 correct answers, that there is enough information in the stem to answer the item. They might have to rewrite some of the distractors. For example, in the 13 items that some of which were problematic, the best strawberry model had 70% of items that we accept as perfect. That's by far the best performance we've seen. But that still means that a SME has to read every item to find the 3 out of 10 that need to be revised or just put aside, and you'll use the remaining 70% of the items. So exciting times. These models continue to get better. I think it's interesting. I don't know what to make of this, so I won't say much about it. That OpenAI has introduced GPT-4 recently. Then they introduced a new version of GPT-4, the Omni, recently. Now they're introducing Strawberry, which is an elaboration on how GPT-4 reasons about things with some fine tuning. Interesting, better, but I wonder why we're not moving to GPT-5. And I think the answer is that it's not so easy to continually improve these models. I'm not saying that approach of creating increasingly complex, better models is stalled, but I think it's not. I think that I'm not sure we realized how enormous of a leap, how from Earth to the moon, GPT-2 to GPT-3 was, and GPT-3 to GPT-4 turned out to actually not be such a huge leap. And I think that they're not going to be able to make huge leaps, but prove me wrong, OpenAI. I'd love to see GPT-5 come out soon and be vastly better. That would be quite interesting. So fun times.
All right. And then we will move on to what is our last planned question. So if there's anything that you've got on your mind that you would like to add to the conversation, feel free to start thinking about that or adding that to the chat.
So this question, I love this question because, if our blueprints aren't valid, then, what's the point? It's extraordinarily important. The exam blueprint sets up how we're going to create the exam, and its validity has to be beyond question. But aside from the fact that there's sort of a standard operating procedure that the blueprint should be job related, job relatedness is shown by a JTA, so the JTA makes the blueprint valid. Aside from that, we really don't have a lot of, research or practice or art built around, what makes a blueprint valid, but it's a hugely important thing. And one of the reasons that why might come up is that there's a lot of different ways to create a blueprint. I've seen blueprints that are arranged in the order that you do tasks in the job. And then, of course, there's many other blueprints where that's not the case. They're, split up the way you would split up the modules of a course or something like that. So I've given some thought to what makes a valid blueprint, which I think Joe Conta has a blog about this, which I loved, if I'm remembering correctly. You should find his blog and check it out. But the first thing I tell my students is that a valid blueprint is a blueprint that all the stakeholders look at and they say, yep, that makes sense. Maybe not every last one, because you know how SMEs can be, they can have strong idiosyncratic perspectives, but there's a consensus view among every stakeholder group. So the candidates who need to take the exam, it's clear what they need to study and how they will do well. Instructors or people who are designing course materials, it's clear to them how they will, present the material. If there's any sort of external stakeholders like a board or external auditors or ISO 17024 auditors, they look at the blueprint and it makes sense. The blueprint might require that you be a subject matter expert to see that it makes sense, but it makes sense. And an example of not making sense would be, this blueprint has nothing about ethics. Or, this blueprint, has 5% devoted to topic A and 10% devoted to topic B, even though I think topic B is more important than topic A. And if there's a sort of a consensus view about those things, those represent flaws in the blueprint. And so the blueprint should make sense to everybody. Another thing that maybe is a little idiosyncratic to my thinking, the blueprint should be hierarchical. Maybe that's obvious to everyone, but there should probably be some major points. There should be a small number of those major points, like 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. There shouldn't be a huge number of those major points, and then there should be sub-bullets within them. And you probably want to limit yourself to 2 levels, or at least, I'm sorry, I misspoke Joe's last name, or I've got Joe mixed up with somebody else. My apologies. But there is a blog that looks at this, and this is the only piece of that blog, and my thinking is the only piece of information that I've seen about what makes an exam blueprint valid, which is so important. You want probably a small number of major domains, and then you probably want some subdomains within it. A person who's going from a learning perspective might want to write a lot of detail, or sometimes people in the JTA want to have a question about each of the tasks. I think that's probably the wrong way to think about it. I think that too much detail is probably not so good, at least in the sense that I'm an expert in job analysis, and I understand how that process can support a really fine-grained level of detail about, what items you should be choosing. I think a better approach is to broadly define in the sense of having a broad domain and then and subdomains of that, and then allow the subject matter experts to choose the topics within that they think is most important. You're already relying on them to write good items, so it's not a huge additional thing to rely on them to pick topics that they think are good. And I think I have personal experience, and I think we have a lot of evidence that they will try and pick good topics. So I think 2 levels is probably the right level. And then the last thing is we use Certiverse uses. Oh, and I'm sorry. The reason that's an idiosyncratic or self-serving point is that our process of creating a blueprint creates an initial draft blueprint where all the topics are at the same level. And I think it's important to probably introduce a hierarchy to that, and that has to be a constructive process that a subject matter expert does. We've looked into AI solutions, and AI can do, it's just like the results I was talking about before. It can do an okay job, but it doesn't always do a perfect job. Maybe it makes a first draft, for example. But I think it's important. And I think sometimes people can be misled, for instance, by our tool into creating blueprints that are very flat and long with lots and lots of main topics. And I think that's probably not a best practice if you can avoid it. And then the other self-serving comment is that Certiverse uses percentage weights. I don't think that we're the only people who use percentage weights. I think it makes a lot of sense if you don't know the exact length of your exam, as opposed to, this topic should have one item. I think it really helps to think about, okay, the pie is 100%. How are we going to slice up the pie? I think there's a lot of advantages, but you should give some thought to what that's going to mean for a specific form. For example, if you have 50 scored items, then you would ideally want all of your weights to round to an even number, because every 2% weight is going to translate into one exam item. And I have seen blueprints that were so detailed that you couldn't actually generate them, or that had to have zero weights on a lot of categories. And I think that, probably you want to give some thought to how you're going to create the forms. And I think it's possible to consider algorithms that aren't that complex that can create forms that are from very complex blueprints. But I'm not sure that everybody is thinking about it that way. I think many people have a simpler conception of a blueprint. And so if your conception is simpler, you should make sure that your weights will support that. And if you want to think about those algorithms, which maybe makes them seem more complicated than they are, if the expected value on an exam form is half an item, that simply means that, half the forms will have one item and half the forms will have zero items. And that means that Form A and Form B will have a slightly different set of items because you're conforming to the blueprint. And I think that that's probably the right way to do things. Not everybody entirely agrees, but that way you're conforming to the blueprint. And the examinee doesn't know whether they're getting Form A or Form B. They have to prepare for every topic at the right level. So I think it's an appropriate way to represent fractional weights or fractional items on a blueprint. So those are the topics that I have to say. I imagine this topic has lots of potential additional comments. And I think we're out of time.
Well, we are at the half hour. So I think going into this was our first time kind of trying this format. We were, trying to determine if we would, fill this time easily or if we would go over. I think in our hearts, we always thought 45 minutes was probably about where we would end up. So if you would like to hang around, you are welcome to. We do have a few other questions that have come in that we can talk through as well. If you're not able to continue, we appreciate it. We did get requests for the transcript, so we will send that out afterwards and have that on the website as well.
And I can cite the sources that I.
Yes, we'll get our citations in order as well. But adding on to the yes, and the recording will be available, Jim, as well. Adding on to the blueprint topic, there was an additional question of, can you speak to methods for comparing old blueprints to new blueprints, and also what methods and mechanisms are required to verify that certified persons comply with the changed requirements?
Well, I think the mechanism for verifying that changed requirements are would be to force them to retest, or and I think that's probably a policy decision that the board makes. But the best way to make sure that they're up to speed on the new blueprint is to test them. And I guarantee that as things change, like psychometrics and the addition of AI and whatnot, that it can be hard for people who hold a designation to maintain their currency. So if the blueprint represents new material or new laws, by far the most appropriate way to determine whether they're up to speed is to force them to retest on the new blueprint. I don't know. I think that that a changed blueprint is very much like, a course is adding something or something like that. There's a lot of subject matter expertise and judgment involved. But if you're worried about the job relatedness of it, or you want the JTA task or the JTA process to set the weights, which would be appropriate, then I would do one of these streamlined JTAs where you take the topics of the new and old blueprint, and you put them on an exam and or maybe just the new blueprint. I'm not sorry, onto you treat them like they're tasks in the JTA, and you put them on a survey, and you survey some members of your professional organization and have them tell you. That would be the way that I would verify a new blueprint. And they might tell you, oh, this isn't important, or it might tell you the relative importance of the new material, or that the importances have shifted. And so that would be the way that I would approach it. Probably, maybe if there was a specific example, I might have a slight elaboration of that, but what I would say.
And you are welcome to send that along if you would like to get a little more specific detail about a situation you might have in mind. We also had a question of, when considering creating training for a product certification, is there any outcome differences of creating a base product training and having people take the test, or training to the test?
So in some circles, having training materials and then testing whether they understood those materials is called certificant, not certification. And the distinction is, certification is that people can be prepared a variety of ways and show that they know the material. And so I think that those two, present similar results. I think that you probably want the same considerations, but with the additional consideration that it's unfair of the candidates if your questions involve something like experience using a product. So there's probably a process used to set the cut score. And I run a lot of those standard setting meetings, and I find that if you ask the SMEs to identify the items that require experience and aren't just related to the materials, and assuming the panel knows the learning materials, I think they're quite vocal about the items that are inappropriate, if that's the main consideration. And the other way to think about that is that those items are just hard, and if you make allowances for that in the cut score, then hard items are fine, as long as you're not having an unrealistic expectation of how the learners will do on your exam. So I hope that answers the question.
Great. And then we had one more, and this might open a broader topic than we have time for, but we can get to later if needed. And can you speak to how to construct a work portfolio assessment?
Well, I've never constructed a work portfolio assessment, and so I guess that I would probably, if I had my druthers, I'd probably start with a JTA and what are the important knowledge and skills, and then I would try. I'm not sure how, when one does a portfolio, that you encourage people to submit works that show, the full breadth of that. Maybe I'm not sure how that is handled, but I imagine that then somebody like an assessor needs to evaluate the works on the basis of those domains. Maybe you reach the end of that and you say, you have not shown evidence that designing this. You've shown evidence that you are able to use designs to create software, but not create the original design, so you fail. Maybe that's how it works. But I think that I would think about portfolio assessment in a similar way to the way that people do structured job interviews. Each work is like an answer to a question. You would evaluate it on a standardized, ideally by more than one person, but that gets expensive. And that would produce a score on maybe a range of different domains. And then you add up those scores across the different works, and you see whether the person has demonstrated adequate, expertise to award them the designation. And if not, then you give them feedback about why they didn't receive the designation. And I guess I'm not sure how in a portfolio assessment you manage the problem of people just simply not presenting you with the evidence that you need. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not sure how that's handled.
All right. Well, that is what we were asked following up. So we appreciate everyone who has stuck around. And if you have any additional questions, any other topics that maybe you'd like for us to talk about in more length at a later time, feel free to reach out. You can get Alan at Certiverse.com or answers at Certiverse.com. We'll go to several of us to make sure that things get taken a look at.
I love a good question, so
yes,
look forward to that.
Almost nothing more. So thank you again for joining us. We will see you in November. We talk about get a little bit more in depth about the innovations and changes that AI is bringing
Oh, yeah.
to assessment, with again kind of that more recent.
That's a good topic. I want to go
That
to
is a
that.
good topic. I think you should go, Alan. It'll be great. So thank you again, and we will talk to y'all soon. Thanks
Take
so
care, all.
much.